So what about safety and security? It's another big aspect at the moment, of course, around the events of the last few days, not least in Brussels, but also elsewhere, have indicated to us that it's still a big issue. The issue of the locked doors, the German wings, maybe MH370, something else still going on. What is interesting is that not enough facts have come out about the work that was done post 9/11, which led to the idea of the armoured doors on airlines to protect the airplanes from terrorists trying to break through and get control of the airplane. The risk that there would be a member of the cabin crew, particularly a pilot, who would have problems or would just go berserk was understood at that point. It was part of the risk assessment that was done. But the risk was considered to be so small as not to be something that was going to override the fundamental risk at the time and threat which was from terrorism coming in. But of course, these sort of things are going to happen because nothing about our business is actually risk-free. In fact, nothing about getting out of bed is risk-free, and I do wish the media sometimes would stop trying to portray these things as something that is possible to do without any risk. Nothing can be done without any risk. So we've got some issues to do with understanding that. And again, as a general aerospace issue, I believe our society should be leading this debate and should be having proper structured discussions about how we take the issues forward and how we make sure that we are delivering acceptable levels of risk within that safety and security area, but not to the point where actually we can't go anywhere. And the idea, if I look at some of the airports, the idea that you simply move the point at which any risk goes further and further away, the answer is it just gets more and more difficult to do anything about it. Because if we take some of the airports and we say you can't go in the terminal without having your bags inspected in case you've got something on board, well, that's great. But actually, that leaves everybody outside queuing in the rain and the snow and everything else that happens to be thrown at you, and you're still exposing everybody to the same risk because actually you're still in a crowd going there. So do we now have to have a system where you only arrive at an airport in onesie-twosies? Well, I'm not sure practically I can see how that's going to work. So we have to understand this business of risk and have to be prepared to talk about it in public and to make sure everyone understands what that is. Because you can't get away from risk. It's just not possible to do so. So in all of the elements that I've talked about, we have decided that this is where the society needs to focus over the next few years. But the one overriding factor here is what we do about youth and about what we do about making sure that they are properly and attracted to the professions that are represented within the aerospace community. It's fundamentally important that they get the same level of excitement that Brian effectively demonstrated about his flying career and passed on, I understand, to a few people, even though some of the words may have been translated in a different way at the time he debriefed them. But the excitement of flying, what it's all about, what it means, but the control that's necessary, the need to bring the youngsters on and to explain to them how they can help in the aerospace environment is something that I think is very important. I'm not sure how many of you have followed Tim Peake in the space station. Have you seen any of his transmissions from there? Oh, what? Tim Peake, who's on the International Space Station. He's okay. Yep, he's up there at the moment. He has done 4 broadcasts so far with youngsters in education facilities to try and encourage them and tell them what it's actually like to be up there. He's a natural. I mean, he should be on the TV all the time, actually, because he's doing it extremely well. And the other day, you may or may not have seen one where he talked about he was asked what it was like to live on board, and he talked about the fact that he could be upside down, this way around or whatever, and he literally turned himself round in the space station to talk to the children. He was upside down, and then he came back again. The interest that he has sparked back certainly in the UK has been phenomenal. That's the sort of excitement we've got to get across to the youngsters about their future and the way this is going to go. I was privileged a few years ago in fact, not a few years ago, 2 years ago, to go along to Richard Branson's launch of the spaceship Galactica idea. This is tourism in space, for those who haven't picked up on this. There are others. I mean, there's an active space program going on here in New Zealand, which is going to be quite interesting to see how that goes forward. But there's lots out there looking at what this is going to mean. But typical Richard Branson was that at the end of the hour-long presentation, done extremely well with lots of good imagery and so forth, He came back on to talk about what this all meant. And he said, look, at the end of this hour, if you take nothing else away, remember, above all else, that space is virgin territory. And that is just the sort of thing that, of course, will get people talking, but most importantly, that's the sort of comment that makes sure people remember what it was all about and what he was talking about. We've got to broaden that out and get out to the youngsters just how exciting and just what this means for the future. If we are to do that, then the Royal Naval Society needs to formally task itself with looking at where we're going to go. If we can't establish ourselves as a respected international voice, prepared to put its head above the parapet and talk about what is important in the aerospace environment, then we're not going to be leading the debate. And we must lead the debate. So first of all, we've got to build on our respectability as an aviation community to speak about matters and to lead the way in the debate that's got to happen. We need to make sure that we're authoritative. Authoritative means you've got to have credibility, you've got to have knowledge, you've got to use the expertise, like you gentlemen in the audience, those of you who have got the ability to contribute in terms of the knowledge, the experience, the activities. We need to draw it out of our membership and to use that as a basis on which we can go forward and deliver the message out there on what is going on. We need not to be the sort of society that tries to double guess what happens in aviation activity. There is nothing worse than a society like ours with a well-respected position but trying to gain that, to turn around and then make comments about an incident that's happened without knowing the facts. There are plenty of pundits out there who do this, and there are plenty of reporters who do this. That's fine. They can do that. That's their business. But if our society is to be respected, then it must be very clear that when it says something, there is genuine analysis and facts behind what it says, and that means it can't respond immediately to something happening in the world. It needs to take a measured view of that to make sure it earns that respect. But it needs to be authoritative when it does speak, so it needs to have the knowledge and the analysis that goes with that so it can do something. It needs to talk about the whole aerospace environment and not just part of it. The very interesting aspect of airspace control came home in the UK at the Olympics in 2012. How are we going to introduce Mach 2 Typhoon aircraft into the airspace over the centre of the City of London? How are we going to make sure that anything that came into the airspace over the city never got in to attack anything in the Olympics? That took a lot of work with the CAA, the National Air Traffic Services, the air traffickers over at Heathrow, to make sure that all those plans could come together. It happened, and by God, not many people understand the amount of work, the amount of coordination, and the absolute importance of the air traffickers in making that work at all. We were launching Typhoons from an airfield that was 5 miles north of Heathrow. We were trying to get them into parts of the airspace over London, right in the approach lanes to Heathrow, to Luton, to Stansted, and all the rest of it. We were trying to do it in an emergency situation, but we didn't want to disturb the entire programme, because otherwise we'd have airlines flying all over the place and a complete shambles going on. It worked remarkably well, because of the pre-planning and the real hard work that went by the air traffic services to make that coordination happen. There were only 3 incidents of note. The first one was, unfortunately, the absolute classic of one of the airliners coming across from France, very late in the day, of course, and got the frequency and the IFF code changes wrong at the critical moment. Now, that shouldn't happen, because the procedures are in there to make sure it doesn't, but Murphy lives them well, no matter what country and what airline you're with, and it happened on the day. Now, that was pretty well sorted out, and unfortunately, no real fallout. The second incident was slightly more, I think, professionally unacceptable to the point of being ridiculous. A hot air balloon operator. They're doing his morning champagne trips with the paying public on board, gets airborne from north-east of London in a southwesterly wind and ends up being blown right towards the Olympic Stadium. His passengers, who were, enjoying, shall I say, the sunset of their lives, were a little concerned when the first thing they see is two helicopters alongside with rifles pointing at them and big signs saying, land now. They landed. It was a bit of an uncomfortable landing, I understand, but that operator will never fly again, lost his license and was taken to court. I have no sympathy with him at all, because he should have known better to do that. The third one is slightly more poignant, I think, for out here, but also somewhat more, shall I say, understandable-ish, and certainly in my passionate nature, rather than my legalistic and logical nature, actually I have more sympathy with. A chap had been flying in his little Cessna 150 from his own farm to visit his daughter and their family twice a week for about 40-odd years. He took off from just north-west of London and transited round and down into Essex to go and visit them at their farm, landed at their farm strip, and later in the day would reverse and go back again. He'd been doing this for the best part of 40 years. Unfortunately, he chose to do it on one of the 12 days of the Olympics. And he was rather surprised to find again a helicopter pulling up next to him with a rifle pointing at him and a sign saying, "Follow me." Poor chap followed, went down, landed, and was incredibly shocked and surprised to know what was going on. It turned out that he had not been anywhere near a flying club in the last 37 years. He'd not had his aircraft serviced in the last 37 years, other than himself. It turned out he did not have a medical. In fact, it turned out he didn't have a license. But he'd been doing this safely and effectively all that time without any incidents. As I say, unattributably, I find myself in somewhat of sympathy with his situation, but inevitably he lost the aeroplane and wasn't taken to court. The situation was handled, shall I say, slightly more diplomatically. But they were the only three incidents that happened, all quite different. But those typhoons were getting airborne, climbing above Heathrow, never interfering with any of the airlines coming in and out, apart from the one, as I mentioned earlier on. And that worked because the coordination that went on between air traffic, pilots, authorities, regulators, and CAA. That is what's got to happen. And I believe, again, that our society has a role in doing that, because it must encompass the whole of the aerospace environment, from the engineering, the research, the builders, manufacturers, and everywhere else, as well as I've talked about. And finally, the society needs to be strategic. It cannot keep picking up on tactical issues and trying to resolve those or trying to address those in its own right. Society has to be about the aerospace environment. It has to come up with ways in which we can develop better systems, better processes, but more importantly, better language, which we can address these issues that the public, and dare I say, the politicians, understand and can relate to. Because too often, they don't understand the technical language that we often use, both in terms of how we do our business and what it is we're doing. So we have to find a way of making this much more understandable, much more straightforward for everyone to understand, and for everyone to therefore be persuaded by the arguments when it comes to how and why we should do certain things and why we should not do certain things as well. So we need to make sure, as I say, that we are respected, that we have authority, that we engage the entire environment, and that we think strategically about what we're doing rather than end up being tactically. So what are those elements that I think are really going to come to bear in the next little while for which the society needs to be prepared? Skill sets and people. Without the right people with the right skill sets, we are not going to be able to make sure this industry, this environment, this entire exciting area of life is progressed, is delivered, and most importantly, is explained in the right way for the future. So youngsters, training, skill sets and explanation are key. I think we need to be ready for the changes of which energy is going to deliver into the aerospace environment. We are talking about two supersonic general aviation 24-seat aeroplanes going to be flying before the end of the decade. This is going to change again how some of the bigger, how some of the smaller aeroplanes operate and where they go. We're talking about the possibility of airspace machines that can carry passengers from London to Auckland in a 1 hour by going pretty high and pretty fast. It's not just theory. There is work being done to deliver that today. There is a great deal of change coming on, and therefore we need to understand and be part of that and be leading the discussions about whether that is practicable and how we're going to integrate it into everything we do. We need to lead the debate on how we're going to balance this need for security and safety in the right ways to make sure that we don't go completely down a particular avenue and we end up finding that actually it's impracticable to do the business with those limitations in place. And we need to make sure that people understand that being part of this environment is fun. I'm not sure how many of you have read Clive Woodward's book. I can talk about it on this side of the sea that divides you and your neighbour over there, because, of course, he was the manager of the England rugby team that won in 2003. It would be, of course, discourteous to talk about it over there, but over here we can talk about it. And he took the team down there, and he then wrote a book. And in this book, he talks about the way in which he approached the England squad when he took over. And what he said to them after the first training session was, what do you think you're here for? And they said, well, we want to win. Oh, okay. We'll talk about it again. He went to the next training session. After they'd been training, he said, okay, have you thought about it a bit more? What it is do you think you're here for? Well, we want to play for our country. Really, he said. Okay, you might want to think about that. They went away. After the next training session, same question. What do you think you're here for? Well, we want to be a team. No, really, he said. Okay. He did this 6 times. Now, those of you who may have heard of Martin Johnson, he was the captain of the England squad at that time. Martin is not known for his eloquent speech. He's not known for his after-dinner speaking. He's known for short, sharp retorts and maybe some that are unexplainable in any language, particularly English. At which point, he became completely fed up with what was being said, and he said to Clive Wood, will you blip, 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 just tell us? And he said, do you not want to have fun? And they all went, what is he talking about? His point, of course, was that you only do your best, you only perform best when you're actually enjoying, not laughing, but enjoying what you do to perform in the best way. And I think he's absolutely right. He was a strategist. He wasn't a particularly good player. He wasn't a great England player, but he was a very good strategist. And his point was, of course, that if you do your best, if you enjoy things the most, your performance will be the best we can possibly ask for. And I think that's what we've also got to make sure people understand about aerospace. It's not just about technical. It's not just about knowing how many degrees this and how many degrees that and what that does. It's the enjoyment of the environment. It's the enjoyment of the experience of flying. It has been a great pleasure to have the chance to talk to you this evening and to be part of the 150th anniversary of the Society. I hope that we'll be able together to guide the Society through the next few years to make sure that it is an enjoyable place to be, that it performs well, and it delivers for all its members, as well as being instrumental in how the aerospace environment develops and how we make sure we are in control of it and we can guide it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Sir Stephen.